All right. Well, welcome to Leveraging Data Management and Data Quality within SharePoint. My name is Mike Berger. I'm a senior consultant at PointBridge. To give you a little information about myself, I've been working in the BI area for about 5 years. The two most recent with PointBridge, so working specifically with Microsoft BI technologies. So spend a lot of time with their ETL tool, SSIS, and then a lot of reporting services, Performance Point, specifically with how they touch SharePoint, so the integration with SharePoint. To kind of give you a little background on my perspective and where this presentation is coming from, like I said, I work with a lot of Microsoft technologies, and PointBridge specifically works with Microsoft technologies as well. So we do a lot of work with OCS and Exchange within the unified communications area, a ton of SharePoint work, and then business intelligence, so a lot of data warehousing, data modeling, and then those integration points once again with SharePoint for some of the presentation layers. So the agenda and some of the stuff that I'll cover here today has to do with using SSIS and SharePoint in order to create some type of master data management scenario within an organization. So the first thing I'll talk about is kind of the challenge that we typically run into in a lot of BI-centric projects with consolidating a lot of dispersed data sources, putting them in one data store, one data warehouse, and all the challenges around data quality, issues with bad data that you typically see in client databases and other stuff of that nature. I'll give a brief definition of what MDM, Master Data Management, is, just so we can all kind of get on the same page before the live demonstration. And we'll also talk through the specific client scenario that brought about this solution, and I guess inspired, for lack of a better word, me to put together this webinar and this presentation to share it with some other people. I'll briefly touch on the approach that we took before the live demo and some of the other options that we weighed as far as other ways that we thought we could tackle this rather than the solution that I'll give you. So I'll kind of open it up there and we can talk about some ways that people in the room have handled data quality and data management issues within a business intelligence project. I guess that's a good time before we get started. I know some of the people in the room, but I guess what's the kind of split here between SharePoint and BI, just to kind of get an idea of the skill levels here. So who's SharePoint oriented with what they do? Okay, and then how about BI? Okay, so it's about half and half, kind of what I expected. So after the approach, we'll do the live demo, and then after that, I'll briefly just touch on some of the pros and cons and touch on some of my experiences that I had implementing this at one of our clients. So the challenge, a big challenge whenever you have a lot of different data sources in a BI project is getting them consolidated into one data warehouse and having like a master list. So when I say master list, like a master list of products, a master list of customers, employees, a lot of the dimensions that you typically have in a data warehouse. An example that I have from real life that kind of replicates the scenario I'm talking about was I got married about a year ago, and what my wife and I decided to do was to each separately come up with a list of our friends. And we decided that if the friends are on both lists, they're definitely invited to the wedding, and if they're on one or the other, we'll have to discuss, just to kind of get the numbers down. So an example of trying to consolidate different data sources is my name, for example. If I was one of my friends, I could have written my name down as Berger, and she could have written down Mike, or I could have written down Mike B. So when we're trying to put these lists together, the first challenge we had was trying to figure out, okay, well, are we talking about the same Mike here? Is Berger Mike? And I think a lot of the times in BI projects we have a similar situation, but with entities within the business. So a lot of different databases you see like a country. So in one example it could be United States. In another database it could be USA. Another one it could be US. They're all legitimate entries in a database depending on the system that they're coming from, but realistically they all mean the same thing. They have one meaning. Another example you typically run into would be like with customers. So in a database, PointBridge could just simply be PointBridge. It could be PBC for PointBridge Consulting, or someone else might call them PointBridge Solutions. So it's really all about getting these different data labels and figuring out, which of these are the same, which are different, and how do we come up with this consolidated view across the business of our products, customers, sales regions, etc. The other situation that you typically run into is not just legitimate duplicates. It has to do with bad data. So an example I came up with here, and I've seen a lot worse than this, would be like US.A, which in fact should also fall under that United States label. I've also been in places where the data entry system has no validation on it, so sometimes people just put XXX, and that's supposed to mean United States. So you run into a lot of data quality issues whenever you're consolidating data sources across the business, a lot of different systems into one place. So what is this MDM thing I'm talking about? What is master data management? Well, master data management really, it comprises of a set of processes and tools that consistently defines and manages the data entities of an organization. I've kind of talked about the data entities already. I always think of it kind of as the dimensions within a data warehouse. Like I said, the products, sales regions, etc. It's really the non-transactional entities. So, like for example, sales, measures and values, or inventory levels and quantities, that's not really something here that qualifies for MDM as a data entity. That's just supporting values and measures around the entities. So with that being said, the main objective of MDM is to provide processes for collecting, aggregating, matching, consolidating, quality assuring, persisting, and distributing such data throughout an organization. So it's a lot of words, but I think they all eventually come down to the same thing. You want one view of your data. When you bring reports into a boardroom, you want to have the same entities, you want to have the same companies on both reports. You want to be able to talk the same language. So quick poll here, take a little break. Has anyone used any MDM software applications? And if so, which ones and were they easy to use?
I'm not using one right now, but one of my clients is using it. It's SAP.
Okay.
And or is it being easy? I don't think so.
Yeah. So it's kind of built into the whole SAP system. Yeah. Okay.
It's definitely been a pain.
Okay. Gotcha. For those BI people in the room, did you have an example? Okay. Gotcha. For those of you in the room, you just brought up an example of Access Apps in Excel. What approaches have some of these BI people taken to this data consolidation and data quality issues? Any ideas or anything that anyone has done in the past?
So in SSIS, you can use a fuzzy lookup.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
9 customers.
Yep. Yep. I've used that before, and to a certain degree it works, to a certain degree of confidence, but you're always going to have situations where there seems to be some need for some type of manual intervention, some level of interaction between a human and the data to accurately map some of these sources. I've gone to clients and I've seen situations where they literally have every single lookup scenario built into the ETL. So they have these huge case statements in some of their queries where it takes care of some of these situations where it's US.A. Well, case 1, it's US.A, make it United States. Well, that obviously is not easy to maintain. It's not easy to change, and it's really just a big pain. Okay, and I think I already know the answer to this last question here, but has anyone here not used SharePoint? So I don't have to talk about what SharePoint is or anything, which is good. Could go on a spiel about that for a while. All right, so on to the client scenario. This specific client had bad data. They specifically had issues across a lot of their databases with the country dimension. And I'll keep bringing that up because that's the dimension I'm going to use in my example. they really had, once we got the data into the data warehouse, they really had no idea what a lot of these country codes meant just because they didn't make sense. I mean, there was no logical mapping for some of these countries. Furthermore, the client didn't want to spend a lot of money on a third-party MDM application or MDM software. They wanted a solution which, fit their budget. On top of that, the client did not like Microsoft Data Services, MDS, which is Microsoft's first-generation tool and kind of Microsoft's first attempt at really tackling this master data management issue, which is available through SQL Server R2, the last release of SQL that they just put out. Personally, I agree with them. I think it's like a lot of first-generation Microsoft tools where they got it out there, and then over time they'll make it better. So that, I don't know if anyone here has seen it, but the interface is pretty clunky, and it's not really a Microsoft interface. If you just looked at it and you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd have no idea it was a Microsoft product. So like the buttons aren't similar to like, they're not, I guess they wouldn't be familiar to a user that's used to Office, so like Excel, Word, PowerPoint, anything like that. It's not easy to use because it's not intuitive for that reason. And the last requirement was that clients wanted to let users manage the data in a tool that they were familiar with, which conveniently for us, most of the clients we work with use SharePoint, so that was an easy answer to that requirement. So the approach that we decided to take, and I'll show this in the demo here in a second, was to use SSIS and SharePoint in order to come up with a master data management system that the user could use in order to manage their data across all their business sources. Some of the other options that we discussed, initially we're buying a third-party tool, which obviously was not an option. Or there's also always the option of a custom application. The benefit of a custom app is you have a lot of flexibility while developing it, but then down the road, if you want to change it, it's a pretty big pain getting into all that, .NET code and everything if the client needs any significant changes later. So what I'm going to be showing you, I don't think for anyone here will think it's earth-shattering by any means. It's not highly technical, but I think the application of how SSIS and SharePoint can be integrated in order to allow business users to manage their data, I think is what's clever about it, and I think it's really a slick solution to a lot of MDM problems that we typically run into in a lot of organizations. All right, so on to the fun stuff, on to the live demo. Do we have any questions at this point about what I'm going to be doing or anything I've said so far? Okay, great. Let me get out of this. So the first thing I'll show you here is the data set that we'll be working with here today. It's definitely an oversimplification of any data set you'd ever run into in a client situation. It'd be nice if data sets were this easy. But I think it'll give us a good idea of how we can use MDM to make sure that we keep this data clean as it enters our data warehouse. So you can see here I came up with a fake staging table with some sales information. It's just a unique transaction ID, a couple dates associated to it. The column I really wanted to point out here, and as I mentioned earlier, is the country code, because this is the one that we're going to be managing with SharePoint and SSIS. On top of that, we have a couple associated quantities and then some amounts, net amount, gross amount, and the sale price. So first here, we will get into the SharePoint list. So in a lot of organizations, and this applies beyond what I'm talking about here, a lot of users have data managed in Excel. So it's an Excel document that typically one person's responsible for updating, and then each month or week or on an ad hoc basis, they email it out to users as they request it. So a list of countries or a list of accounts for the accounting department, any sort of data. A good place to put that is on SharePoint for a couple reasons. Because on SharePoint, it's a lot easier to manage. It's a lot easier for users to access. And you can take advantage of all the other SharePoint out-of-the-box features. For example, security, you can control who sees the list or even who sees which items on the list. You have approval processes and workflows that you can set up, and you also have alerts. So people can be alerted when new items are added onto lists. And all that stuff is what you'll see in the demo here. So what we have here is what is called the Ref ISO Country List. And this is a big start towards MDM and master data management here, because this is already a consolidated view of countries. It comes from the standardized ISO country list, which you can purchase online, which just has the widely known numeric codes, alpha codes, short names, full names for all the countries in the world. For our demo purposes, this list is used to populate our dim country dimension, which we'll get into. And we'll also see here that we have a lookup value column. I'll show this to you real quick. The lookup value column is a calculated column in the SharePoint list. And it's really pretty simple how it's set up. It's really just a combination of a couple of the fields. So within SharePoint Lists, you can take a couple columns and you can create what's called a calculated column. So here, for the purposes of this demo, I took the alpha 3 code, which is the 3-digit code for the country. I concatenated it with a dash, spaces on each side, and then I took the short name of the country. The reason that I did this is we have a country mappings list, which is the second SharePoint list we'll use in this demo. What this list is, and this is really the bread and butter of what's going to be happening in this demo, this is essentially the lookup table for our data warehouse. So as data comes into the system, it's going to be checking against this list. It's going to say, my data source is coming from SQL Server, my country code is GER, which country do I map it to? Why the other list is important here is if we want to add a new item to this list, I'll add one quickly. So you can have multiple systems, source system value. I'll show USA, and I'll actually, for a demonstration purpose here, I'll actually map USA to Mexico. So a couple things to point out in this list is, a lot of times when you're having a data warehouse, you're going to have multiple source systems. So it's important that in this list we keep track of the data source name. Just because USA from our SQL Server database is mapped to United States doesn't necessarily mean that USA is mapped to United States in another database. Now that might be a bad example, but when you start talking about other stuff like products or employees by employee name or customers, just because it's a code in one database doesn't necessarily mean it equals the same value in another. When I added this, you can see when I click on the drop down, this map to country here is just a list of all those lookup values on the previous list. So the only values that a user can ever select or ever map a source system value to is that consolidated list. So if they want the data to get into the data warehouse, they have to assign it to one of the pre-approved countries from the dim country dimension. I'll go ahead and approve this item real quick. All right. Has anyone within SSIS worked with the SharePoint List adapters? Okay. So this is pretty cool, and it's a pretty powerful tool, which I've actually used quite a bit on projects. You can see here in our data flow task for our lookup table. Our lookup table comes from this country mapping list. And I'll show it to you here real quick. It's a very simple table, and I'll load data into it in a sec. Same fields, the data source name, the source system value, the map to country, and then, which is actually just the 3-digit code on that concatenated field, and then the full code as well. Within SSIS, what you can do, and I'll provide this link after the demonstration, is on Codeplex, they have a SharePoint list source and destination, which you can install on the server that is running SSIS. When you do that, what it does is it makes available, here if you've worked in SSIS, you might think this is pretty cool. It adds the SharePoint list source and the data flow sources, and it also adds a SharePoint list destination. The other cool part about this, if you've worked with SSIS, you'll know it's not always the easiest tool to work with. It's pretty specific. The cool part about this little add-in here is it's very easy to use. All I have to do is I simply type in the site URL, I type in the list name that I want, which is our country mappings, and then you can even get as specific as looking at the list view if you want to. So we're pulling from the country mappings list, and we're looking at the all items view, which is the standard view on this list. Yeah, all items right here. Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and load some data quickly here. So what this package is doing, it's very simple. It's first taking all the data from the country mappings list and loading it into our lookup table. It's then taking all the data from our, it's just starting here now. It's then taking all the data from that ref ISO country list and loading it into here, our dim country, so our dimension table. And since these SharePoint tasks are so easy to use, I mean, it's literally, for my example here, just pulling from the source. I'm only pulling in approved items, so I have a conditional split here. That gives you the ability that if users are adding items to a list and it's in the status of pending, we don't pull those in until they're approved. That allows you to even set up a multiple layer approval process. So you can have the first person attempt to map it, they then send it to the manager, they approve it. Once the manager approves it, it's quote unquote live and it will be pulled into the data warehouse. The last thing that we have here is this is an example of what would be our fact load. So we're pulling all the data from that staging table that I showed you. The first thing that we're doing is we're looking up the country code. So you can see here we're taking the data source name, the source system value, and the map to country from Lookup Country. I'll show you that table here again. Now that it has data, it'll make a little more sense. So on the top here, once again, is our staging table. And then you can see here on the bottom, you'll recognize these 5 values coming from the SharePoint list, being pulled in by that SharePoint adapter and loaded into the table. So what we're doing first is we're taking the country codes from our staging table, and we're saying, okay, we're loading from the SQL Server database. Let's look for this source system value. So in this first row here, it would find row 5, and then what's the country it's mapped to from our reference country list. So this is really where it's forcing the data to conform to that country list and really ensuring that all the data that loads into the system is part of that reference list. Let's load this. The next step takes it one step further, the next lookup does. So now that we know the country code that we need is the US, we take that lookup code that was returned from the previous lookup, and we look up the country code in our dimension. But to show the dimension table here now, and show how everything comes together, we now know from the first lookup that our map to country code is USA. And then from our country dimension, if we scroll down into the U's here, you can see that country ID 232 is associated to USA. Then when we look at our fact table, you can see that first row that was values in 99. That's how we get, and it's the typical design practice in BI is to use that surrogate key from the dimension within the fact table. So the country ID is now just the ID from the country dimension just represented in the fact table. Okay, well this is all great right now, and this works well because we started with 15 rows. You can see here, and since all of these combinations existed in our lookup list on the SharePoint site, if we look at the fact table, we ended with 15 rows as well. So, with that being said, what happens now when we load a record in the table that doesn't conform to one of those lookups? So I'll go ahead and add just another dummy record here. And I'll do like Canada, for example. And
you're adding this to your staging table, Mike?
Yes, adding this to the staging table. So what this is replicating would be a new sale comes through in the transactional system, and we want to see it get loaded into the data warehouse the next time that the data is loaded. Okay, so we have that in here. So what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and just run the ETL one more time. And I think it'll all start becoming a little more clear what I'm trying to show here. All right, it's going right now. Up back into fact sales here once it loads. So what we can see here, and you might have noticed the second path that we had before. In the first step where we're looking at the country code to conform it to the list, you can see those original 15 records made it through. And that one record that we added with the country code of Canada, CAN, didn't make it through. And in fact, what we did is we loaded it into what I call, it's the data fallout table. The fallout table is really, a replica of the staging table, but what it does is it temporarily stores the records that are in staging that don't load into the data warehouse. The reason we do this is that so data is not lost. Typically in a data warehouse situation, you want to try to pull the deltas. And what I mean by that is each day that goes by, you only want to pull the data that has changed since the last time you loaded data, so you're not pulling millions and millions of records each time. Since we're going to get past the period where this record loaded, if we don't store this record somewhere, and then we say, tomorrow, let's just load everything from all the sales that came through today, it's not going to pick up this record anymore. So if we don't have it somewhere and if we don't know it fell out, it's just going to be lost in space, and all of a sudden our sales quantities and amounts don't match up. Another thing that this did, and I'll show you the list first, if we go to our country mappings list and refresh the page, you'll see that it added a record into our mapping list. So you can see now it's from our SQL Server database, source system value is Canada, but it has no mapping. That's because we don't know what to map it to. Someone's going to have to come into this list and figure out that, oh, well, CAN from the SQL Server database is actually Canada. I'm not sure if it's sent it yet or not.
Did it insert into your lookup table? No,
not yet. So right now, and I'll get an alert here.
oh, you inserted it using the SharePoint target.
I'll show you this right here. What are you talking about the SharePoint list? Yeah, so I'm running everything under my domain name. The modified by would be whatever your ETL is running on under. That was some other domain account. Yep. So you can see here, and the cool part about this is
Email notification.
Yep. And the powerful part about this is I just got an email notification here because I'm signed up on this list to get alerts whenever a new item is added. So it tells me, okay, I have a new record that's pending from SQL Server, and the source system value is Canada. The benefit of this is, without alerts, I don't think this would be very useful because people would have to go in every morning. They'd have to check the list. Is there anything new that I need to map? And it'd just be one of those things that people, they push off and they forget to do. I think with the notifications, and this is the out-of-box functionality I was talking about with SharePoint, it's more actionable. You see the email, you click on the link to view the mappings, you map it, and you're done. So how did this get into the list? I'll show you that real quick. So if we go back into the SSIS package, the last step after we load the fact table grabs everything from the fallout table, and it actually compares it to everything that already exists in the SharePoint list. The reason we have to do this is if I ran this package 5 times in a row and I didn't merge these two to see if the record already existed, we'd have 5 records in there for Canada and 5 records that weren't mapped. Well, that's not what we want. That's not useful. We just want the distinct values for each system to create our lookup tool. And the reason this works is we're getting the country code and the data source from our fallout table and also from our SharePoint list. So doing a left outer join between the two sources, we know that whenever the source system value from the SharePoint list is null, that record doesn't exist in the SharePoint list. And it gives us the green light to go ahead and add it into the SharePoint list as a new mapping that's needed by the end users. So here's really what decides to either let the records through or not. And that's just what I said. It's just an easy check. If the source system value is null, if that's true, we load the record into the SharePoint list. So without doing anything else, I'll just go ahead and show you quickly. I'll go ahead and not change anything and just go ahead and execute the package again. Now this is a very, very valid scenario here where either someone didn't get around to mapping the country or they're on vacation. So for multiple days in a row, what's happening is that record from our fallout table is still sitting there, and the record in the SharePoint list hasn't been mapped. The reason that we can do this is that in the SSIS package, whenever we're loading data into the fact sales table, we load it from 2 places by using a union. Open here in a second. So I'm loading data from the staging table, and I'm also doing a union, and I'm pulling down here, I'm pulling the data from the fallout table as well. So the same records, the same columns, excuse me, not the same records, the same columns and everything, so that if I'm doing daily alpha loads, I'm always pulling the latest day's information plus whatever's in the fallout table. So if no one ever goes in and maps that Canada record will keep trying to load every time the ETL runs until somebody eventually maps it. Otherwise, it's just going to be on the fallout table for all eternity. Yeah.
Wouldn't that mean that all of your reporting is incorrect? Right, because you're not loading certain facts.
Yes, yes. So for that day, your totals aren't going to be 100% accurate. And
that day or that month or that year.
Yeah, whatever you're rolling it up. But the intent here, and this is one of the pros I'll talk about later, is this really pushes the logic and the responsibility of maintaining the data onto the business users and away from IT. Which I think if you talk to anybody in IT, they'll love that. And you talk to business users, so they might be like, they might not agree, and they might think it's cool that they can actually control their data as well. The reason that this is beneficial is a lot of the times when you're doing these mappings, and the country example I think is an oversimplification, but a lot of the times when you're mapping the data, you need a business rule. And it's not up to people in the IT department to come up with these rules. It's not up to people in the IT department to manage these rules. It's really the business users that when they look at the data, they've been using the data forever, they know, oh, well, every time I get an Excel report, the first thing I have to do is I have to take US.A and US.A, and I have to combine the totals and then delete one of the columns every time they get a report, just because they're used to saying 2 rows, even though it should be the same data source. So one of the drawbacks is, yes, your totals until that record goes through are going to be off, although people in the business will be aware of it because you can send out those alerts, I guess on the other side of things, the benefit of this is you're not letting all that crap through.
Right.
You're not letting that bad data through.
I think there could. This is really cool, but I think there could be some type of hybrid approach, right? Where it's sort of what it's called an inferred record.
Yep.
Right? But actually, all the accounts are right, but maybe it's not mapping to the right country or that, and you still have this type of solution that allows the end user to update that country code, which would in turn update your dimensions.
Yeah, and update the fact table.
That way your accounts are not.
Yep. So you have to, at the highest level, your counts would match, but more than likely that record would be thrown into an unknown bucket, within the country dimension. Yep. So I agree. I think a hybrid approach could work well here too. So what I did is I loaded, I just loaded the data again without changing anything. So what you'd expect here would be the same thing. And just to show that data is not getting duplicated here, since it is doing the union, it's getting those distinct records. We still only have 15 records within the fact table and 1 in the fallout table. And also you'll look here in the Lookup Country table, we still have a record for Canada. And that's simply because in our scenario, the user hasn't gone in yet and they haven't updated this record. The way that the package is developed, and I've mentioned it once before, but the benefit of having the approval status in the SharePoint list is we're not pulling anything here into the data warehouse until it's approved, meaning that someone's thought about it, someone's mapped it, and someone understands the implications of what they've done within the lookup list. So I'll go here and I'll go ahead and map this to Canada, and I'll save it. I'll click on it one more time. I'll go ahead and approve it as well. So it's been approved, and it's now a candidate to load into the data warehouse. So one more time, I'll come in here. And I'll run the ETL one more time with that Canada mapping within the SharePoint list.
Yeah.
Is there any courage in that if you approve something in that list that it automatically hits the ETL?
Yeah, I'm sure there'd be a way to do it. I haven't done it for this demo, and we didn't do it for the client that I did this at. We just load the data once every night, and then they actually have another data set that runs like once every hour, so the change actually gets picked up on the hour by that as well. So it's pretty timely and for a lot of situations and clients. I mean, I haven't been on a project where people needed data more frequently than that. So, all right. So what we see here is in the fact table, now all 16 rows made it through, which is what we would have expected. If we take a look at our lookup country, we can now see the Canada record in here, added into our lookup list. And if we look at our fallout table and our fact table, you can see our fallout table is empty now, and that Canada record has made it through. So I think, I mean, people here have already thrown out a couple suggestions on how to improve this. I think this is just really a very simple way to show, business people that they can manage their data. It is possible, and it takes a lot of the responsibility off of IT. So rather than having the hard code values into SSIS packages or coming up with custom maps to allow users to map this stuff, you can use something and tools that a lot of users, especially at companies that I work at, are familiar with, SharePoint. They get the email alert, they go manage the data, the next day, boom, the record's in there.
You thought about dumping the fallout records into a SharePoint list as well so they can see what that data was?
Yeah, no, that's another great suggestion. I don't know if people on the phone could hear that, but the suggestion was to go ahead and dump the fallout records into another SharePoint list just so they're visible to end users. Another way to perhaps handle it would be to have a dimension or a flag on your fact table to mark it as a fallout record. So you could browse the queue and say, just only give me the legitimate records, or give me all the records plus the fallout records. And that would be another way to keep your totals in there temporarily. All right. With that being said, from my experience, the pros to this solution are, first off, it's SharePoint. Like I said, you have the approval processes, the workflows, SharePoint security, and pretty much any other function or anything you can come up with that's possible in SharePoint you could use in this solution. The SharePoint interface is familiar to users and it's easy to use, and the solution is easy to grow and maintain over time. And so as compared to like a custom solution that's developed in .NET, if we want to add this functionality for another dimension or a whole new system comes online and you have to modify the whole solution, here all you have to do is add a SharePoint list and a simple SSIS package, and you can start managing it right away. The last benefit, and I've mentioned it twice, and I think it's great because I come from the IT consulting background, but the business manages their own data. The responsibility to upkeep the data warehouse and make sure that the data in there correct falls on the business. There's people using it, there's people that want it to be correct. In a lot of situations, it should be their responsibility to manage it as well. Some of the cons, once again in SharePoint, from my experience, SSIS and SharePoint lists play well once they're configured, but sometimes getting them there is not easy. So if you have an SSIS package built, like the one that I have, and I wanted to come into this country mappings list, if I wanted to change this column from source system value to system value, it changes on the screen, but underneath the covers, it doesn't change. So getting the SSIS package to recognize that, then you have to go into the adapter and refresh, and then all of a sudden none of your conditional splits work, none of your derived columns work. It can just get messy. So the biggest tip I have, if you're going to use any SSIS in SharePoint, and especially when you're migrating from like a dev to staging to production environment, you have to be 100% sure that all the columns have the same name and that they were created with the same name the first time. Otherwise, you're going to get errors. That was a big pain point doing that. Another pain point can be that business users may push back. I mean, it's a new job responsibility. It's going to be something additional that they have to do in their day. I think the important piece to take away from this is you have to identify those kind of data champions and data stewards in the organization that live in the data. They expect the data to be right, and they want to take on the responsibility, part of the responsibility of ensuring that it's right within the data warehouse. Another drawback can be that initially it might not be as customizable out of the box as a custom app or a custom solution might be, although, once again, SharePoint does have flexibility with some development to make it a little more customized to a tweaked situation or scenario that somebody might be interested in. So with that, that's my mugshot, my contact information. I've included some additional resources I can send in the slide deck to Jesse or Fred afterwards. Wikipedia, that's where I got my definition of MDM, so it's no big deal. But the link here for the SharePoint adapter, if you haven't used that before, you might just want to play around with it because it's pretty cool. I think SharePoint lists are a great place to get some of that data out of Excel and in front of the users and make it available to everyone.
The adapter for 2005 and 2000?
Yep, it works for both. And I'm running everything on 2008 R2 and SharePoint 2010, so it works for SharePoint 2007 and all that too. Yep. So that's it. Do we have any questions or anything?
So one of the challenges, so the one thing you mentioned was a sliver of MDM around conformity, right? Mm-hmm. That's the values being accurate and consistent across the organization.
Yep.
But one of the biggest challenges is that I have a product, and that product can be represented across 4 different enterprise systems the same way. Mm-hmm. So maybe a user manages products in SharePoint, But the biggest challenge is first getting someone to manage it and getting agreement on what that conformity looks like.
Yep.
But the next piece becomes operational. How do I make sure that all of my systems are integrated?
Mm-hmm.
That product A is called product A in every single one of those.
Yep.
And when product A changes, every single one of those is called product A.
Mm-hmm.
Have you used or seen any solutions that either work with SharePoint or some other standalone that can help kind of facilitate that bi-directional?
I really haven't. I mean, in a perfect world, what you want to do is when you identify one of these things, you actually want to go back to the source and you want to correct it there. So everywhere where I see XXX, if I want to make that USA, I should do it in the source system. The problem in the consulting world is sometimes we're stuck to a certain division and the data might be outside of that division. Or the person that manages that database, they don't want to adhere to what people map to here. They're like, no way am I going to take a value that you give me and just let you do updates in our transaction system. So that's where you kind of get into some of the bureaucracy within organizations and some of the challenges working with different groups. But I agree that in a perfect world you could find a way to push those values back to the source system. So at a certain point you're no longer cleaning up the data is just clean everywhere. And then if you update a product in a SharePoint list, like for example in our reference country list here, like if I wanted to change one of the values here, it'd be cool if it pushed it out to those systems. But I haven't done that personally, and I haven't seen that. I think this is just, for a lot of organizations, a good starting point to get them thinking about master data management, what it is, and how to clean up their data.
You can't necessarily have to push it, like what you want to say, maybe the SharePoint list is really the table behind the SharePoint list be the source of support.
There's ECS.
Yep. And what we did on this project, this is just one example, like the country list, but we have lists of like data scenarios, transaction types, accounts, departments, that they were just storing in SharePoint, or excuse me, they were storing in Excel sheets. So now that we have it in SharePoint lists, it's their organization's job to spread the word that if I want to create a data set that uses one of these dimensions, I should grab the data from here.
You could also, instead of sort of hold the data back in to people, just 11 people have it shown in something that's a SharePoint.
Oh yeah. Yeah, BCS, yep.
That way the applications can tie to it directly, because there's always some lacking things with trying to treat SharePoint as a relational database.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you store the raw data in a list, it's just SharePoint as the interface.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah, BCS is pretty cool because you can also, change the value in a list and it posts it back to the table. Yeah. Well, that would be cool.
What about data volume challenges? I got 1 million SKUs and I'm managing that product list.
Yeah, I haven't managed a dimension that big in a SharePoint list, but I can tell you that it probably wouldn't be pretty. I mean, if you're getting up into the millions. One of our lists has tens of thousands, and it's actually pretty quick. It's not bad. 2010's a lot better. 2007, you would have problems.
Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm looking through the two some of the other things, like when you're looking for unique value, I don't know if you were about that.
Well, I actually, what I do first is I take this data and I load it into the lookup table. So when I'm looking through values, I'm doing that against the SQL table, not the SharePoint list.
You're not using it. You're not really looking at pressure. You're getting it during a chart or something.
I'll show you. I get what you're saying now. Well, lookups for loading like the fact table. I think what you're talking about here is I pull all the records and I do the merge. So I'm not looping through it. I'm just pulling the records, comparing it to the fallouts.
You should hold the data level. Theoretically, you shouldn't have to.
And even performance, so I'm less concerned usually with the performance, because it usually always gets better as the tools go on, but like user manageability, right? The interface and 3 million SKUs and opening basically a grid, right? How does that really work? I think that becomes a challenge as well.
One cool thing is you can use all the columns so they filter and sort.
Yep. Or yeah, you can put a search, or another thing you could do in the list, you only show the unmapped records. You don't necessarily have to show everything that's been mapped as well. It can be searchable. Yeah, with views in SharePoint, you can do anything you wanted. Yeah. Cool. All right.
Just globally on a trade system, the same way you did with the Access applications, we didn't have the same thing as SharePoint, but we distributed it out the file system in the MDM layer, to a separate data warehouse for database, however we wanted to model it, and then define our grade based on what issues were going to arrive, because we had to deal with, like, I mean, when you're talking about stocks, you've got stocks on every different location in the world. So you had to match the stocks in real time, so you use CPC to match the product mapping, and then email everyone on the work client to get that lookup. We actually looked up against websites. So we jumped back to multiple websites, and then we just pulled it right back, and then we have real-time pricing. And so we did jump across into, it had product mappings on portfolios, and then mapping, like, all products. So it's really complicated. Because you got to gauge, I mean, how many links you have to portfolios, it's a huge issue. So the financial is really complicated. But we do these assets because they're the tools to do it. And you can use K2 on top of it, and you can leverage the sequential all those workflows. Just like trying to kick off new jobs. And it just gets a little crazy. But we used paging off that many volume. We just paged out our multi-Python assets with Django. Fill it up and done. And just use forms over data and just the data manipulation with emails system. And it's really quick. I mean, SharePoint has a whole new flavor to it, but DCS and that, you're going to get lost in SharePoint. It's fine.
Yep. All right, well, thanks.